Frank Sinatra made the drive to Dean Martin's house on March 14, 1995. He had not been there in months, maybe longer. When he walked in, the house was quiet. Too quiet. Dean was in his chair. Frank sat down across from him. He tried to start a conversation, asked how Dean was feeling. Dean did not answer. Frank tried again, asked if he needed anything. Dean looked at him, really looked at him. And then he said 4 words that made Frank stand up and leave. 4 words Frank would never repeat to anyone, not to his wife, not to his children, not even to Joey Bishop when Joey asked what happened. Because those 4 words were not meant for anyone else. They were Dean's way of saying something Frank had been refusing to hear for years. And once he heard it, there was nothing left to say. Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin met in 1945. 2 singers trying to make it in a world that already had too many singers. They were not friends at first. They were competition. Frank had the voice. Dean had the charm. But somewhere in those early years, something shifted. They realized they were better together than apart. By 1960, they had built an empire. The Rat Pack. 5 men who owned every stage they walked onto. Vegas, Hollywood, the world. And at the center of it all were Frank and Dean, the leader and the sidekick. That is how people saw it. That is how Frank saw it. But Dean never saw it that way. Dean Martin understood something about fame that Frank never quite grasped. That it was all performance. Every joke, every song, every moment in front of people. You gave them what they wanted. And when the lights went off, you went home. You did not take it with you. Frank took it everywhere. For Frank, the Rat Pack was not just an act. It was family, brotherhood, something real. He needed it to be real. Because without it, he was just a singer from Hoboken who had gotten lucky. Dean knew it was an act. A good one, maybe the best one, but still an act. And that difference sat between them for 35 years, invisible to everyone else, but always there. Frank would call Dean in the middle of the night, just to talk, just to hear a friendly voice. Dean would answer, make a joke, keep Frank company until he fell asleep. Then Dean would hang up and go back to bed. Frank thought those calls meant something, that they proved the bond was real. Dean thought they were part of the job. In 1988, the Rat Pack tried to reunite. One last tour. Frank, Dean, Sammy. The world wanted it. The money was there. It should have been easy. But Dean walked away after 5 shows. He told everyone his kidneys were failing, that the doctor said he needed to stop. Frank believed him. Sammy believed him. The press believed him. Dean's daughter knew better. She saw him the day after he quit the tour. He looked fine. Tired, but fine. She asked him why he really left. Dean told her he was too old to pretend anymore. She asked what he meant. He said Frank still believed the act was real, still thought they were brothers, still needed Dean to play the part, and Dean was done playing. She asked if he had told Frank that. Dean shook his head, said Frank would not understand, that Frank had built his whole life on believing the stories they told on stage, and Dean was not going to be the one to take that away from him, so he let Frank believe the kidneys were the problem. Let Frank think it was medical, not personal. It was easier that way. After the tour ended, Frank kept calling, kept trying to pull Dean back into the world, but Dean was somewhere else now, somewhere Frank could not reach. The calls became less frequent. Then they stopped altogether. By 1995, it had been months since they spoke. Frank told himself it was because Dean was sick, because the end was close and Dean needed space. But that was not the truth. The truth was Frank could not handle seeing Dean without the performance, could not handle the silence that came when Dean stopped pretending they were something they had never really been. March 14th, 1995. Frank decided he could not stay away anymore. He had to see Dean, had to try one more time to reach him. He drove himself, parked in the driveway, walked to the door. It was unlocked. Inside, the house felt like a place where time had stopped. The curtains were drawn, the lights were low, everything was still. Dean was sitting in his chair by the window. He did not turn when Frank walked in. Frank stood there for a moment, taking it in. His friend looked smaller than he remembered, thinner. The years had carved him down to something fragile. Frank sat down in the chair across from him. The same chair he had sat in 100 times before. During parties, during quiet afternoons, during moments when the world was not watching. He tried to smile, tried to bring some lightness into the room. Dean did not smile back. Frank asked how he was feeling. His voice sounded too loud in the silence. Dean did not answer, just kept staring out the window at nothing. Frank tried again, asked if Dean needed anything, if there was something he could do. Still, nothing. Frank felt something tighten in his chest. This was not how it was supposed to go. They were supposed to talk, supposed to laugh about the old days, supposed to remind each other that they still mattered. But Dean was not playing that game anymore. Frank leaned forward, called Dean's name, gently, the way you do when you are trying to wake someone without startling them. Dean finally turned his head, slowly, like it took effort. Their eyes met, and Frank saw something in Dean's face that he had never seen before. Not in 50 years of friendship, not in all the stages and studios and hotel rooms they had shared. He saw the truth. Dean was done, not just with performing, not just with the world, with all of it, the whole thing, the life they had built, the stories they had told, the man he had pretended to be. He was done, and he was letting Frank see it. For the first time, without the mask, without the charm, without the joke that would make it easier to swallow, Frank opened his mouth to say something, to ask if Dean was okay, to offer help, to do something that would make this moment feel less final. But before he could speak, Dean said 4 words. 4 words that were not loud, not angry, just clear and certain. Frank's entire body went still. He stared at Dean, waiting for him to smile, waiting for the punchline, for the moment when Dean would break the tension with that easy grin and everything would go back to normal. But Dean did not smile. He just looked at Frank, and Frank understood. This was not a conversation. It was a statement, a door closing, a boundary being drawn that Frank could not cross. Frank stood up, not because he wanted to, but because staying meant hearing more, meant facing something he had spent his entire life refusing to accept. He walked to the door, stopped, turned back one last time. Dean had already looked away, back to the window, back to whatever he saw out there that Frank could not. Frank left. He got in his car, sat there for 20 minutes, hands on the steering wheel, staring at the house. He did not cry, did not call anyone, just sat there, trying to process what had just happened. Eventually, he started the car and drove away. When he got home, his wife Barbara asked how Dean was doing. Frank told her not well. She asked if he was going back. Frank said no. She did not understand. Dean was dying. Frank should be there, should be with him. That is what friends do. But Frank could not explain it, could not tell her that Dean had made it clear there was nothing left for Frank to do, that the friendship she thought was real had been something else entirely. And now that Dean had stopped pretending, there was no place for Frank in his life anymore. A few weeks later, Joey Bishop called, asked if Frank had seen Dean. Frank said yes. Joey asked how it went. Frank paused. Then he said it was fine. Joey knew it was not fine. He could hear it in Frank's voice. He asked, "What happened?" Frank told him Dean was tired, that he did not want visitors. Joey asked if Frank was going back. Frank said no. Joey did not push. He knew Frank well enough to know when a subject was closed. But he also knew something had happened in that house. Something that Frank was not ready to talk about. Maybe would never talk about. In the months that followed, Frank tried to go about his life. He performed. He made appearances. He smiled for the cameras. But people close to him noticed a change. A heaviness. Like he was carrying something he could not put down. His daughter Tina asked him about it one afternoon. She said he seemed distant, distracted. Frank told her he was fine, just getting older. She did not believe him. She asked if it was about Dean. Frank looked at her, and for just a second his mask slipped. She saw the pain underneath, raw and unguarded. Then he blinked, and it was gone. He told her Dean was dying, that it was hard, that he wished things were different. She nodded, said she understood. But she did not, because Frank never told her what really happened in that house, never told her what Dean said. Never told her that the friendship she'd watched her whole life had been built on something Frank believed and Dean never did. Dean Martin died on Christmas Day, 1995. 9 months after Frank's last visit. The funeral was small, family mostly, a few close friends. Frank did not attend. People were shocked. The press called it cold, unforgivable. How could Frank Sinatra not show up for Dean Martin's funeral? They were brothers, the Rat Pack, legends together. But Frank knew something the world did not. He knew that Dean had said goodbye months ago, in 4 words, in a quiet house, with no audience, no cameras, no performance, and showing up at the funeral would have been pretending that goodbye never happened. Pretending Dean had not made his choice clear. Frank could not do that, could not dishonor the one honest moment they had ever shared by turning Dean's death into another show. So he stayed away. He sent flowers, no card, just flowers. And he carried those 4 words with him for the rest of his life. Frank Sinatra died 3 years later, May 14th, 1998. In his final months, his family noticed he would sometimes go quiet in the middle of conversations, like he was somewhere else, thinking about something he could not share. His daughter asked him once what he was thinking about. Frank smiled, that same smooth smile he had given the world for 60 years. He told her just old memories, old friends. She asked if he meant Dean. Frank nodded. She asked if he missed him. Frank thought for a long time. Then he said something that surprised her. He said he missed the idea of him. She did not understand, Frank explained. He said for 50 years he thought he and Dean were brothers, thought the bond was real, thought the late night calls and the jokes and the stages they shared meant something beyond the act. But in the end, Dean had made it clear it was always an act, always a job, and Frank had been the only one who did not know. His daughter started to argue, started to say that could not be true, that Dean loved him, that everyone knew that, but Frank shook his head. He said Dean cared about him, in his own way, but love and performance are not the same thing, and Dean had spent his whole life performing, even for Frank, maybe especially for Frank, because Frank needed him to. She asked what Dean said that day, the day Frank visited. Frank looked at her, and for the first time he told someone, 4 words. I was never him. She did not understand, asked what it meant. Frank told her it meant Dean was never the man Frank thought he was. Never the brother, never the partner, never the friend who believed in the Rat Pack the way Frank did. He was always just a kid from Steubenville who learned how to play a part so well that everyone believed it, including Frank. And in the end, when the performance was no longer worth the effort, Dean stopped. And he let Frank see who he really was. Someone who was tired. Someone who had given the world everything it asked for, and now just wanted to be left alone. Frank said he understood it now. Why Dean said those words. Why he pushed Frank away. Because keeping up the act for Frank's sake would have been one performance too many, and Dean did not have it in him anymore. Frank's daughter asked if he was angry. Frank shook his head. Said he was not angry, just sad. Sad that he had spent 50 years believing in something that was never real. She told him it was real, that just because Dean saw it differently did not mean it was not real for Frank. Frank smiled, thanked her, but she could see he did not believe it. Because once you know the truth, you cannot unknow it. And the truth was Dean Martin had been performing his whole life, and the day he stopped, Frank Sinatra was no longer welcome. Frank Sinatra died 3 months after that conversation, quietly, at home, surrounded by family. At his funeral, people talked about his music, his movies, his legacy. They talked about the Rat Pack, about the golden age of entertainment, but no one talked about the 4 words Dean Martin said to him in March 1995. The 4 words that ended a 50-year friendship in 2 minutes, because Frank never told anyone else, only his daughter, and she kept it to herself. Some truths are too heavy to share. Some friendships are built on what we need them to be, not what they are. And sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is let them keep believing the story, even if you know it is not true. Dean Martin did not do that. He told Frank the truth, and in doing so, he gave Frank something no one else ever had. Honesty, not the kind you want, not the kind that feels good, the kind that changes everything. And Frank carried it with him until the day he died. There are friendships that end with a fight, with words said in anger that can never be taken back. And then there are friendships that end with 4 words said in quiet, words that are not cruel, not meant to hurt, just true. Frank Sinatra walked into Dean Martin's house looking for his friend, and he left knowing his friend had never really been there. Not the way Frank thought, not the way Frank needed. Dean had been performing the whole time, for 50 years, and when he finally stopped, there was nothing left for Frank to hold on to. Just the memory of a man who was never quite real, and the 4 words that proved it. I was never him.